Have you painted many birds, but for some reason you're just not quite satisfied with the outcome? Are you familiar with the wet on wet technique? Maybe there's some things that you're missing. So I'm hoping that this video will explain a lot about the techniques I use and all the steps. The first thing is to actually study the reference image and to locate all the shadows and make sure that we know where are those highlights. And one of the things I do is I squint my eyes just to make sure I don't focus on too many details. The first thing you want to do is to wet the paper. Wetting the paper is a very important step and it should not be done quickly. You actually want to wet the paper for a few minutes. Because this is 14 by 19 inches, that's how large this sheet is, I wetted this flamingo for about 5 minutes. The longer you wet the paper, the more time you're going to have to apply the colors wet on wet. The next step is to prepare your palette. So the colors, dilute your colors with water because you don't want to get caught in the middle of like applying the first couple colors. Next thing you're trying to grab cobalt blue, but the cobalt blue is dry on your palette, and then you have to spend that time diluting that cobalt blue with water. And in the meantime, the paper is drying. Mix your colors on the paper, not the palette. If you mix colors entirely on your palette, it's very easy to get into the muddiness of colors. You don't want that, especially in this case here. You are using actually a very basic color palette. I'm using primary colors, yellow, blue, red, just different shades of red maybe, or different shades of yellow. But you want to quickly grab these colors from your palette and then continue applying them to the paper so you can see the separation of colors. This is when I pay attention to the light and shadows the most, because if I cover too many areas with colors, where's my light? So I have to visually designate areas. Even if I don't see them quite in the reference, I do need to designate areas that are going to stay as light as possible. I do want some color to bleed in there, but it also depends if I'm adding background or not. Since I'm painting with primary colors, I can easily just use shade of blue for the shadows. And when you mix primary colors together very gently, you create different shades of gray. You can play with that gray depending on how much yellow or how much blue or how much red you add to that blend to determine if it's a yellow gray, blue gray, or red gray. It doesn't always mean I need to use shade of blue for the shadows. It depends what I am painting, but I am painting with primary colors here. I'll give you a different example. Let's say I was painting a red apple. Okay, red is a primary color. When you take a look at the color wheel, green is a complementary color to red because it's on the opposite side on that color wheel. So if I'm painting a red apple, what color would I use for that shadow? I would use green. So I would add that green to my shade of red. One of the things I like to mention in my classes is actually the importance of using a larger brush. I see this common mistake because a lot of people use very tiny brushes for something large to cover. The thing is that you're working so hard and the paper is drying if you use that little brush. So how about just using a larger brush so you have more coverage? And you can manipulate the brush, the bristles, whether you want to use the full brush or maybe just the angle of it, or maybe just like you want to flatten the brush. So you want to create this way a thinner line or brush stroke. But I definitely don't recommend painting with a tiny brush. Now, light and shadows are the most important, right? But we also have to think about the contrast. I do have here light and shadows, but I feel like the contrast is missing just a little bit. So what will I do about the contrast? I will use creamy paint at this stage of painting to apply colors wet on wet. So the paper is still wet, but it's not as wet as it was a few minutes ago. That means I have to adjust the ratio between water and paint. Yes, I am using now a tiny brush. Well, it's about size 3, round size 3. But this is because I'm applying this combination of yellow, blue, red toward very small areas only. and it's just for the contrast, and I don't need wide, thick, big brush strokes. So contrast between the head and like the rest of it, so the beak, between the beak and the head, and then we have the neck and the rest of the body. So those are small, narrow areas. That's why I'm using a smaller brush. You can make your artwork more fun with splatter. However, I don't recommend splattering just to make things look better. Try rather using splatter to make it more fun. So think of it this way, like I'm not trying to fix my painting by splatter or cover up my mistakes. Try thinking like I'm going to splatter this artwork because I want to add something extra to it. Splatter is fun, but again, if you use it to cover up some mistakes or you just don't like your artwork, then it kind of like misses the point, at least in my opinion. When I first started learning how to paint with watercolors, lifting was the hardest for me. I could not figure out the timing, that perfect timing to lift the colors. Someone even gifted me a book, a watercolor book. It was a botanical watercolor book. And the teacher just did not really explain well how to lift the colors. Basically said, you just need to lift here and there. And I was just sitting there and trying to figure out what is that timing to lift the colors. So in my teaching now, I focus a lot on explaining how to lift the colors. First, you have that shine over the paper. The paper is shiny wet, but then that shine goes away. Once the paper feels almost damp or it's already damp, that's the timing to lift the colors. Now, please keep in mind that lifting is not always successful because it depends, number one, on the paper you're using. Number two, what colors you used, because some colors simply don't lift well while others do. So let me know if you enjoyed this video, and if you're looking to paint this flamingo with me in the class, I would like to invite you to join me on Patreon, where you will find a real-time recorded class, all the explanations you need, how to paint these loose feathers, basically to not overwork the feathers and to capture the overall look of the flamingo and focusing on light, shadows, contrast, and splatter is just optional. Thank you so much, and please let me know if you have any questions.